17.7. Listening. Part 4. What if? Exam practice. You'll hear part of a broadcast.
And in the studio today are Alan Forster and Jane Watson, both experts on early 20th century history. So, Alan and Jane, could the First World War have been avoided?
Probably not. John Keegan says the First World War was a tragic and unnecessary conflict, but I believe that the question in 1914 wasn't so much if a continental war would break out, so much as when it would happen, what form it would take, and who would be the winners and losers. But it could have been confined to a scale that wasn't worldwide in its events and influence.
I think it could have been avoided if things had turned out differently. At the very least, it could have been much shorter by years, with the savings of millions of lives if things had happened differently. And it could, of course, have turned out differently. Germany could have won.
Also, no one could have foreseen which nations would take part in the conflict. Nobody could foresee that the conflict would be so enormous, or change so much, or last so long. At the start of the war, in August 1914, people said it'll all be over by Christmas.
It all began when Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo on June the 28th, 1914, right?
Yes, and on July the 29th, the Austrian army started to attack Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. On July the 31st, Austria, Russia, Turkey and France mobilized their armies. But Great Britain seemed ready to watch from the sidelines and remain neutral. It was a European affair, the British government thought. Relations between Britain and Germany were actually improving. Then Germany began to mobilize and declared war on Russia, Serbia's ally. France was Russia's ally, so they were committed to supporting Russia.
And so that made France and Germany into official enemies then?
Yes, and so what Germany did was to march through Belgium to attack France from the north. It was at this point that the British government joined the war, knowing that this would bring the Germans a mere 30 kilometres from the English coast on the other side of the Channel.
Yes, they could have put all their efforts into attacking Russia in the east, but this was considered to be the responsibility of the Austrian army.
What if the British had delayed this decision by a week and not started moving troops across the Channel when they did?
Well, the German army would have reached the coast, but the French could still have prevented them from reaching Paris. It would have been too late by then for the British to move sufficient forces to France. This would have given Germany an overwhelming advantage. At this stage, some sort of deal might have been reached.
Yes, the Battle of the Marne was the major turning point. It was after this that semi-permanent trenches were dug and the Western Front was established, a front which would hardly change for 4 years.
In August 1914, the Germans should have won. The mistake they made was to remove men from the right wing, the western wing closest to the sea, and send them to the eastern front to protect Germany from Russian attack. They also strengthened the left wing to protect Germany from attack from France. If they had maintained the strength of the right wing, their plan would have succeeded, and the French army would have been contained inside a sort of sack with the German forces all around them. The right wing was too weak to complete this manoeuvre.
And then there was a lost map, wasn't there?
Yes, on September the 1st, a French patrol captured a German dispatch car, killing all their soldiers. They found a map which showed the German military plans for their next attack, which would bring the Germans to within 30 kilometres from Paris. This knowledge enabled the French to anticipate the next attack and stop it, and to keep the Germans over 100 kilometres from Paris, a stalemate that would continue for another 4 years. The front moved back and forth a few metres in various places, but in most places it never moved at all. Millions of lives were sacrificed for a gain of a few metres.
And the war might have been won by the Germans when, on October the 31st, they attacked the British line at a place called Gelluvelt, near Lille, in northern France. They broke through the line and started to advance, but then they stopped for further orders. None came. 1,200 untrained Bavarian reservists waited for further orders instead of continuing the attack, which would have taken them to the sea, cutting the British army in half. An English brigadier, Charles Fitzclarence, who was on the spot, made a swift decision. He sent all the men he had, a mere 370 men, in an attempt to stop the Bavarians. Against all odds, they forced them to retreat and ended the German advance. Many of the Bavarians were killed, many were captured, but some managed to get away. One of those who escaped was a private from Austria, Adolf Hitler. What if he had been among the soldiers killed? Just one bullet would have changed.
Well, also, if the Germans had won, and they could have done this by reaching Paris, the war could have been over by Christmas. Millions of lives wouldn't have been wasted.
What if the war had ended sooner? if Germany had made peace with France and Russia in 1914?
Well, in Russia, peace would have allowed the Russian industrial economy to flourish instead of being tied up in supporting the armies. And there would have been further moves towards democracy, which had been stopped by the war. There would have been no sealed train arranged by the Germans from Switzerland to St. Petersburg to carry Lenin to start his revolution.
And if the war had ended sooner, so many lives would have been saved.
Exactly. Writers like Wilfred Owen and Rupert Brooke would have lived. There would have been an Ernest Hemingway, but no farewell to arms. And the most wonderful opening paragraph of the century. Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees.
But without the events of 1914, with its trench warfare, remorseless killing and disregard for human life, men like Adolf Hitler wouldn't have repeated this cult of death 20 years later.
So, without the First World War, there would have been no Treaty of Versailles in 1919, no Second World War, and with no Bolshevik Revolution, there would have been no Soviet Union and no Cold War.